Hurricane Harvey was a natural disaster that affected many people in the Houston area. This presentation focuses on the connection between a person's vulnerability relative to their demographic area and their likelihood of being flooded during Hurricane Harvey. In a study published by the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, it was found that results in Houston indicate Hispanic immigrants have the greatest likelihood and non-Hispanic whites the least likelihood of residing in a 100-year flood zone. A 100-year flood zone is an area with a 1% chance of flooding each year. Because these areas are often undesirable by residents, they are frequently cheaper, and therefore immigrant communities often flock to them as they are not as expensive. After Hurricane Harvey occurred, ABC News released the following statistics. 80% of Texans do not have flood insurance. 185,149 homes are estimated to have been damaged by Hurricane Harvey. Over 10,000 people were rescued by federal forces alone as of August 31, 2017. And 42,399 people resided in shelters as of September 1, 2017. So what do these statistics mean, and what does the previous study mean? It means that before Hurricane Harvey even occurred, immigrant and minority populations, those most vulnerable in communities, were already set up to be most affected by Hurricane Harvey. This study wants to ask the question, can GIS provide insights on whether or not demographically vulnerable communities are concentrated in areas that flooded during Hurricane Harvey? To answer this question, we are first going to map the most vulnerable neighborhoods using 2010 block group data. By most vulnerable neighborhoods, we mean neighborhoods with greater than 30% minority, greater than 40% of the population without a high school diploma, and greater than 30% of the population as low-income families. We are then going to map the least vulnerable neighborhoods using 2010 block group data, and by least vulnerable, we mean communities with less than 30% minority, less than 40% of the population without a high school diploma, and less than 70% of the population as low-income families. We are then going to overlay satellite images of flooded areas to create maps displaying relationships between flooding and relative vulnerability. Hopefully, this spatial analysis will provide us some insight onto whether or not vulnerability affected a person's likelihood of being flooded. To do these, we used GIS and used the model here to create these maps. We first mapped less high school percent, minority percent, and low income percent, and then combined them using the weights listed on the previous slide to come up with areas that were most vulnerable and areas that were least vulnerable. We then mapped satellite images of Harvey floodwaters over these two maps and came up with areas that were people who were flooded and vulnerable and people who were flooded and less vulnerable. The first map here shows vulnerable areas and non-vulnerable areas. Vulnerable communities can be seen in red, whereas non-vulnerable communities can be seen in green. It's easy to see that the more vulnerable communities are located more centrally in urban areas of Houston, whereas the less vulnerable communities are located further away from the urban center and are more likely to be on the coast. This is a map showing all of the areas that were flooded during Hurricane Harvey. Of course, more of the city was flooded, but because this study is focusing on certain neighborhoods, only the neighborhoods that we're focusing are currently highlighted. We can see from this map that our original hypothesis that vulnerability affected a person's likelihood of being flooded is wrong. Both vulnerable and non-vulnerable communities were flooded at about the same rate. Pretty much everyone was affected by Hurricane Harvey in an equal way. Here is a zoomed-in picture of the urban center of Houston, where a lot of the minority community was, and it's hard to see where vulnerable areas and non-vulnerable areas even are because the blue is blocking out most of them. So again, our original hypothesis that vulnerable communities were more likely to be flooded is wrong because all communities were flooded by Hurricane Harvey. So what does this mean? This research project looked into the relief aid that communities were receiving after Hurricane Harvey occurred. A document released by the City of Houston entitled Hurricane Harvey Relief Efforts Supporting Immigrant Communities included several pages of resources designed to help immigrant families affected by Hurricane Harvey. When you look into this document, there's only one section that says for non-English speakers. Most immigrants, because they are immigrants, do not speak English, and yet only one section of the City of Houston's relief efforts document is for non-English speakers. And when you click on these two links, you find that both pages are in English. It is surprising to see that the City of Houston is not giving immigrants and its vulnerable population the support it needs in the languages that they speak. A study done by Applied Geography in 2009 states that minorities are disproportionately undercounted using traditional methods and underestimated using currently accepted techniques. This means that when relief efforts are done in a community that has experienced a natural disaster, minorities and vulnerable communities are often undercounted and underestimated and do not receive the relief they need. This study was done in New York, and so it's clear to see that this is not a problem just in Houston. It is a problem in multiple locations in the U.S. Another study published by Disasters about floods in Wales states it is the non-white communities in Wales that confront the most disproportionate level of flood risk and lack of knowledge that enables people to be aware, to be prepared, or to recover expediently after a flood emergency. This is a huge problem, and it's obviously a global problem. Vulnerable communities are not prepared for floods before they come and not supported after floods or other natural disasters occur. They do not receive the education they need before the incident, and they don't receive the relief they need afterwards. Some suggestions for future research include conducting research on where current relief efforts are going. This study hypothesizes that vulnerable communities are not receiving the relief they need, but to truly understand this problem and get all the facts, more studies need to be done on these communities and the relief that's currently happening in Houston. Another suggestion would be to survey victims about their experiences both during and after the storm. Because the victims are the ones receiving the relief, they are the ones that authorities want to hear from, and they are the ones who should be dictating what kinds of aid they receive. A third suggestion is to monitor which neighborhoods are receiving relief after a natural disaster. As we saw in the previous studies, this is not just a problem in Houston, it's a problem all over the world. Vulnerable communities are not receiving the relief they need, and we need to spend more effort monitoring that all neighborhoods and all people receive equal relief aid after a natural disaster. It's also important that we study several different kinds of natural disasters and not just floods, so that we can fully understand the problem at hand and how vulnerable communities are affected by natural disasters.